Welcome back, folks. Mr. Delcourt here for another remote learning session. Today we're into April, and that means we're into a new month, which means it's time to do a little reading and reflection. And we know the deal at this point. We're going to use Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. We're going to pick a section from the month of April out of the book. There's one that lines up perfectly with what we've been studying lately. So let's jump right in and check that out. First of all, the story we're going to read today, you've probably already seen, is called Bur Oak. And Leopold really describes a lot of the attributes of this species here throughout the story. This is right out of your Forest Trees in Maine book. We do have Bur Oak in Maine, but really none around here. And I maybe have only ever seen one or two, and that would have been up near the University of Maine where I went to school. If we look at that map of distribution in the state, it's really found in kind of low, wetter areas in the central and eastern Maine area. So you're not going to find a lot of Bur Oak around here. You can tell it's a relative of the white oak, though, with those rounded lobes and deeper sinuses, but it's kind of got that larger, rounder lobed area out on the end compared to a normal just Quercus alba leaf. So yeah, Quercus macrocarpa is Bur Oak, and that's what Leopold is going to be writing about today. So let's go back here. If I were you, I would upload the PDF I posted for the reading into iBooks, which I've already done. And that way you can have the reading open in one app and you can flip back and forth and you can look at your actual assignment that we're going to work on, the Bur Oak reading and reflection. You can upload that to Notability and work on it the way I've got it set up here. So I'm in Notability, I can quickly swipe, boom, right back to iBooks, and I can check my reading. So just like we normally do in class, I'm going to read this story with you. I'm going to ask that you follow along with me on your screen as I read, and we'll stop and talk about what he's kind of getting at in some of these passages that may be a little trickier to understand. But yeah, this is an interesting one for the month of April. So let's see. Starting out with Bur Oak here. When school children vote on a state bird, flower, or tree, they are not making a decision, they are merely ratifying history. Thus, history made Bur Oak the characteristic tree of southern Wisconsin, where the prairie grasses first gained possession of the region. Bur Oak is the only tree that can stand up to a prairie fire and live. Have you ever wondered why a thick crust of corky bark covers the whole tree, even to the smallest twigs? This cork is armor. Bur Oaks were the shock troops sent by the invading forest to storm the prairie. Fire is what they had to fight. Each April, before the new grasses had covered the prairie with unburnable greenery, fires ran at will over the land, sparing only such old oaks as had grown bark too thick to scorch. Most of these groves of scattered veterans, known to the pioneers as oak openings, consisted of Bur Oaks. So what he's getting at there is a form of disturbance that we've already learned about. We talked about succession a couple lessons ago. We said succession always begins with a disturbance in the forest. And when you think about a grassland prairie, a place like Wisconsin that used to be mainly prairie, that was kept prairie by a disturbance. Your lawn is kept prairie by an artificial grazer. We said instead of a bison, it's kept prairie by a lawnmower. And you could do the same thing if you burned your lawn once a year too. You would keep it lawn, just as these natural prairie fires would have kept the grassland grass. And what he's talking about is this Bur Oak has really thick outer bark, that layer we call cork, and that serves as kind of a shield to these fires that would burn across the prairie. And if an oak got old enough and got lucky enough to avoid one of these fires before it grew old enough, that thick layer of cork will help it survive. So that disturbance he's getting at is all about fire. That's the main disturbance out there on the prairie. Engineers did not discover insulation. They copied it from these old soldiers of the Prairie War. Botanists can read the story of that war for 20,000 years. The record consists partly of pollen grains embedded in peats, partly of relic plants interned in the rear of the battle, and there forgotten. The record shows that the forest front at times retreated almost to Lake Superior. At times it advanced far to the south. At one period, it advanced so far southward that spruce and other rearguard species grew to and beyond the southern border of Wisconsin. Spruce pollen appears at a certain level in all peat bogs of the region. But the average battle line between prairie and forest was about where it is now, and the net outcome of the battle was a draw. So what he's talking about is we can look at the historical record. We can look at pollen grains that are essentially stored in swamps and layers of peat, dead plant material in these swampy areas. and they can bore down into that peat and they can look at the pollen grains preserved there for thousands of years, and they can tell what kind of trees were around. They do the same thing here in Maine when they study past climates in Maine. And a guy that will really get geeked up and excited to talk about peat moss and increment boring and moss and looking at pollen grains is Mr. Frost. Grab him someday and ask him about it. He'll love it. One reason for this was that there were allies that threw their support first to one side, then to the other. Thus, rabbits and mice mowed down the prairie herbs in summer and in winter girdled any oak seedlings that survived the fires. Let's talk about that real quick. He's saying that rabbits and mice helped to keep the broadleaf herb plants down and allowed the grass to really grow. And then in the winter, they girdled any oak seedlings. Remember we talked about girdling a tree. That's where you chew the bark in a ring all the way around the tree, or you could girdle a tree with a wire inadvertently, or with a chainsaw just by scoring a ring around the tree. We call that girdling because it breaks off that inner bark and cambium layer in a ring all the way around the tree, and you've essentially killed the tree. So he's saying squirrels and mice help to keep the prairie by eating the herbaceous plants and girdling those trees in the wintertime. So now he says, squirrels planted acorns in the fall and ate them all the rest of the year. June beetles undermined the prairie sod in their grub stage, but defoliated the oaks in their adult stage. But for this geeing and hawing of allies, and hence of victory, we should not have today that rich mosaic of prairie and forest soils, which looks so decorative on a map. So what he's talking about there are squirrels actually helped the oak trees spread, right? And there's a lot of record of that. We think northern red oak after the last ice age spread extremely rapidly because of gray squirrels and also blue jays, two creatures that would take those acorns and carry them long distances and plant them in the ground, saving them for later. We know they don't remember all of them, and they inevitably plant a whole bunch of trees. So squirrels were helping the forest side, even though they ate some acorns. And he talks about June beetles, how they kind of did a little bit of both, right? They chewed on some of those prairie plants as grub stage in the ground, but then once they hatch out into an adult June bug, they fly off and eat oak leaves. So they kind of were fighting for both sides a little bit there. All right, on to the next page here. Jonathan Carver has left us a vivid word picture of the prairie border in pre-settlement days. On the 10th of October, 1763, he visited Blue Mounds, a group of high hills, now wooded, near the southwestern corner of Dane County. He says, I ascended one of the highest of these and had an extensive view of the country. For many miles, nothing was to be seen but lesser mountains, which appeared at a distance like haycocks. They being free from trees, only a few groves of hickory and stunted oaks covered some of the valleys. In the 1840s, a new animal, the settler, intervened in the prairie battle. So prior to the 1840s, this guy, Jonathan Carver, he created a record that said, man, it was grass as far as I could see in this area. So then in the 1840s, a new animal, the settler, intervened in the prairie battle. He didn't mean to. He just plowed enough fields to deprive the prairie of its immemorial ally, fire. Seedling oaks forthwith romped over the grasslands in legions, and what had been the prairie region became a region of woodlot farms. If you doubt this story, go count the rings on any set of stumps on any ridge woodlot in southwest Wisconsin. All the trees except the oldest veterans date back to the 1850s and the 1860s, and this was when fires ceased on the prairie. John Muir grew up in Marquette County during this period, when the new woods overrode the old prairies and engulfed the oak openings and thickets of saplings. In this boyhood and youth, he recalls that the uniformly rich soil of the Illinois and Wisconsin prairies produced so close that tall a growth of grasses for fires that no tree could live on it. Had there been no fires, these fine prairies, so marked a feature of the country, would have been covered by the heaviest forest. As soon as the oak openings were settled, the farmers had prevented running grass fires. The grubs, or roots, grew up into trees and formed tall thickets so dense that it was difficult to walk through them, and every trace of sunny oak openings vanished. So what they're getting at there is when people arrived and they began plowing this area and creating crop fields, they disrupted the prairie and prevented those fires from really spreading. Every couple of years or so, you'd have a massive prairie fire that would burn huge tracts of land. But once you till that soil and you turn it into farmland, those prairie fires stop very quickly, and so does the disturbance. And we know that when disturbance in the forest stops, that succession kicks in and begins, and what do you know? You fast forward 100 years and you've got forests everywhere in Wisconsin instead of grassland. And here's a really memorable quote that I like, and I'm going to have you guys reflect on in a minute. But thus, he who owns a veteran bur oak owns more than a tree. He owns a historical library and a reserved seat in the theater of evolution. To the discerning eye, his farm is labeled with the badge and symbol of the Prairie War. So that quote right there, thus he who owns a veteran bur oak owns more than a tree. He owns a historical library and a reserved seat in the theater of evolution. There are all kinds of examples like that in the Maine woods all around here, of examples of our history on the landscape. One we're going to talk about here coming up is stone walls. These stone walls that we have running through the woods all over southern Maine are a sign that that landscape was once settled by people and was once used for agriculture as pasture land or even cropland. And it's a subtle sign that a lot of people may miss, but it's a great example of Aldo Leopold's quote here about, you may own a historical library and not even realize it. Another example of a historical library could be just a really big tree in your yard. And when you think about the change in the landscape that tree has overseen, long before your lifetime, it can be amazing to think about. Remember that dendrochronology lab we did week 1 in the class, and we looked at growth rings, and we realized that every tree is really acting like a time capsule, right? They're out there just putting on a ring every year, but we can look back through those rings and we can think about the things that were going on around that tree that allowed it to have a good or bad year and put on a thick or thin ring. So another classic example of a historical library is right in my mother and father-in-law's backyard. They have a big, giant, open-grown, round oak tree. We call these wolf trees, and these guys, they might be growing in the woods. I showed you one of these in our PowerPoint presentation a couple classes ago. They may be growing in the woods now, but you can tell by their shape that they once grew in an open field. And there's a classic one of those right behind my mother and father-in-law's house. A big, giant, ancient red oak tree with a huge round crown sitting in the woods amongst a bunch of really straight, skinny oak trees that all grew together in the woods. And I can look at that tree and tell, holy cow, that tree probably sat in some farmer's dooryard right here in the middle of a cow pasture in what is now a neighborhood in very urban Saco, Maine. So another example of a historical library. Maybe you have one of those old wolf trees in the woods behind your house, or maybe your house is near a stone wall. Or can you think of maybe another example of a subtle sign of man's impact on the landscape, or even some natural changes, some succession going on around your house? See what you can do there as we go back and we look at our assignment. I want you to identify the form of disturbance that Leopold credits with keeping the prairie from quickly becoming forest. We talked about that earlier. Identify one creature that helped keep the prairie grassland and another that worked to help the forest spread. We talked about that too. And then in the final paragraph, we talked about that quote. What kinds of subtle signs can we look for on the Maine landscape that serve as our own historical library? And we just talked about that as well. So gave you plenty to work with here today. It's a really interesting story, that Bur Oak story, and I really wish we had them around here that make it hit home even more, but you got to get up there to the Bangor area to start finding some of those Bur Oaks on a regular basis. But thanks again for tuning in today and participating in our remote learning. As always, with any questions, shoot me an email. I'm